Hi everybody, welcome to Bodies Week. I'm going to give a series of 3 lectures on the body, and I'm going to cover a wide amount of material and am going to refer to a couple of theorists who are not reading this week, and you might notice that the readings are a little bit might seem a little bit odd and diverse this week. But that is because I made changes to the readings in light of COVID and issues about bodily borders and contagion that have come up. Now, the readings we had done in previous years, I would recommend to you. That's the Susan Bordeaux Unbearable Weight, which is about, amongst other things, thinking about conditions like anorexia and agoraphobia. And body normalization more generally. I'm going also at some point to make reference to a quote from a theorist named Paul Preciado, who has published just this past year a really amazing article on the body, Foucault, and COVID, and I recommend that to you. It's online in a journal called Art Forum. Okay, so without further ado, let me get started with the PowerPoint. Okay, so I'm just going to begin actually with this title, because know thyself is a phrase that reaches way back to classical times. It's a very well-known phrase, and I just want to make the point that I've conjured that at the beginning of this series of lectures, because that really was the motto for the development of the study of anatomy, which is the foundational discipline of medicine. And it really is also a kind of motto for the arts, for literature and visual arts, because lots of what we produce is really about knowing, that phrase, what it means to be human, knowing our relationship with the wider world, etc. Okay, so without further ado, why the body? Well, this is a collage of images, and I'm just going to very quickly whip through this just to make the point that the body is absolutely central to, our existence, to culture, and to literary studies. So if we begin, let's say on the top corner there, we have this guy here with the beard. This is a very famous American doctor who was also a writer, wrote Gothic tales, S. Weir Mitchell, who also interestingly studied patients of the American Civil War and so named the phantom limb syndrome. Now, he wrote a book that set out something called the rest cure for nervous women, but mostly women. And the rest cure is something that was prescribed to this woman here, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who rightly balked at the rest cure and had some searing criticism of it and of her doctor who would prescribe it, and so he appears hovering unnamed in the background of the yellow wallpaper. Now, he studied under Freud for some time, and as we know, Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, so he hovers behind Weir Mitchell's project, and as we know, all of this stuff is behind similar cures that were prescribed for Virginia Woolf, who then also wrote a text called On Being Ill. Now, Freud studied under a French doctor, also very, very famous, Jean-Martin Charcot, who is down here in this portrait painted by a French artist in which Charcot is demonstrating to members of a salon that met to come listen to him lecture and to demonstrate hysteria, and that's one of his hysterical patients. Now, he employed photographers, so we have artists and writers here. he employed photographers to take photos of his hysterical patients in action. So here's some examples in the middle here. Because he believed that if you looked at photographs long and hard, you would find the secrets on the external body of what was going on in the mind, internal body. Now, photography was also used by a number of writers, artists, and medics, including the American artist Thomas Eakins, who studied photography, took photography, painted nudes, but also studied anatomy. And here's two of his very wonderful, huge, large paintings of two doctors, surgeons in Pennsylvania at work. So these are two paintings in which medicine, the body, writing, painting, visualizing, photography, all this sort of stuff comes together. And I could talk more about what's happening in these images, but I won't because we'll run out of time. The point of this is just to drive home the fact that medicine, the body, sciences, culture, all this stuff, and the readings should indicate that this week, is really mixed up together and tightly bound together, and they have a hugely complex, interwoven, tentacular set of relationships between them. Okay, so if we're thinking about theory and what kind of approach is this, there is a theoretical approach called body studies, which sort of really, you could say it was always there, but really sort of emerged as a theoretical methodology, theoretical approach in the 1980s. So what is body studies? I guess we could say it is the exploration of bodily practices and values surrounding the body. We're interested in representations of the body, both visual and literary. It explores, the condition of being embodied. We are all embodied, and we live and experience the world through our bodies. And the body is the locus of complex crystallizations of culture. As Susan Bordeaux, who I mentioned earlier, says, the body is a medium of culture. So everything out there operates on the body and through the body. And one of the big questions I guess we ask is, how does the body relate to wider culture? And there's a lot of, and you'll notice from the readings, a lot of mixture here of thinking about the body as text. Things are imprinted on the bodies, as one historian critic, Kathleen Brown, says. Or to conjure Foucault here, who's really strongly one of the key thinkers in body studies. Power relations in the world, invest the body, they mark it, they train it. We are text, we have signals, we sign things. Our bodies are docile, they are shaped by society, by culture, everything in it. And William Ewing, some years ago, in a book called The Body, really makes the point that the body is really at the center of all kinds of debates. And it's not just fashionable, it emerged in the 80s and it was a fashionable approach for some time. It is urgent because the body is constantly being rethought and reconsidered, and it's being reconstituted this day and age by scientists and engineers. That is, all kinds of things like cybernetics and big data and hooked up to computers, but also, of course, vaccinations and all this sort of stuff that's happening to us in the last couple of years. Okay, so one of the, I guess we could say, branches or related approaches is medical humanities, which is really in the forefront these days. And medical humanities, we can think of it as a variety of disciplines that explore the social, historical, and cultural dimensions of science, of knowledge, medicine, clinical practice, and our healthcare policy. So it's really the fusing, as it says in the title, humanities, the arts, culture with science and medicine, the bringing together of disciplines. And so we really want to think about this as being body studies as being very interdisciplinary. It's inclusive. There's real value and usefulness. There's a real usefulness through thinking about the relationship between what we do and then what people do in labs and in medical clinics. Okay, so let's have a wonderful look through history and think of some of the key issues that have emerged around the body. And these are sort of key issues that are there in the whole of the history of literature, history of art, and also, of course, in all kinds of other writings and modes of expression. So one biggie is the issue of mind and body. What is the relationship between the mind and body? That is a sort of perennial question that's been there. And we can reach way, way, way back to the beginning of time. But for us, one of the sort of key figures is the philosopher René Descartes. And there's something called Cartesian dualism, which you may have heard of, which is really a philosophical principle that Descartes articulated, which is that the mind and body is really distinct. So he says, the mind is distinct from the body. The mind or soul, which is the word he would most often use, precedes, it's there before the body. There's something divine about it. It goes and lives on after the body degrades and dies. But I want to point out that even in Descartes, who is describing the split between mind and body, is also saying that they are so closely joined together that they are like a single thing. And he sort of identifies a place on the body, the pineal gland, where the soul would enter the body. And I won't go into the rest of these quotes. They're there for you if you want them. There's Virginia Woolf from On Being Ill, which I just referred to, in which she says, so she sort of makes the claim that literature doesn't or hasn't historically dealt with things like flu and typhoid, pneumonia and toothache and all that stuff, that it's focused too much on the self, the soul, the mind. So whether or not you agree with that is a point of discussion. Okay, now along with that is this question about what is the body? Is it a machine? Is it this material machine-like clockwork thing? Is it sort of like this image that we have here of this mechanistic machine / body with all of its little parts working kind of like a factory? Or is it this divine, wondrous thing which we'll never fully understand? So Descartes said, although he is obviously a religious thinker and thinks there is a soul, says, I regard the body as a machine. And more strongly, in the 18th century, Noel said, the human body is a machine which winds its own springs. And the materialist, sort of mechanistic thinker Thomas Selfridge Smith, medical doctor in 1833, said the human body, when dissected, is as much more beautiful than any other piece of mechanism. It's curious and wonderful. So these quotes are sort of against the idea that the body is this sort of divine thing which is God-given, is sacred, which we can never understand. Instead, these quotes are sort of saying, yeah, it is this thing we can understand. We just have to dissect it, take it apart, look at it, examine it, and see how it functions, and we will understand someday all of it. And this side of the debate, these people would say that there isn't some sort of divine secret. It is nerves and blood and bones and all of these things. That is the secret. That's the curious, wonderful thing of the human. It isn't some intangible spiritual thing. And so this debate is there. You should think or notice in literature and art, there's something called the aesthetics of anatomical realism, for instance, and other terms. It's there then in all that literature that's about looking in the interior, inwardly, thinking how we function physically, but also psychologically. It's there in the whole sort of long tradition of realism, which looks at human desire and motives and compulsions and all that sort of stuff as being very bodily based. Okay, there is in this, alongside literature, also in literature, a huge emphasis on visuality, on ways of looking at the body, opening the body, ways of representing the body, and that stretches way, way back. And we should really see literature as being very much affected by things going on in natural philosophy, as it was called, or anatomy, medicine. So what we have here, for instance, these are up here wax anatomical models of the 18th century, and you can see they are very much medicine and culture fused together, because we have this woman in this sort of position of Venus. She's very aesthetically pleasing, she's beautiful. My phone just keeps going crazy. And there's real hair and pearls, and she's on a bed of silk, but this is an anatomical model. It's showing you the interior body, and we still do this today. Up here we also have a contemporary real, that is a real dissected placinated body from Gunther van Hagen's exhibitions of body worlds. And if you've never been to those or don't know anything about them, I advise you that you should Google Gunther van Hagen's body worlds, and you'll see what that's all about. Okay, and also artists are doing this today. This is Damien Hirst. I'm not a huge fan of Damien Hirst, but we can see from these this exhibit that he is also doing similar things. And I'm going to skip because I'm not a fan. Okay, another issue is collecting, categorizing, and classifying. So the body has been the focus of ways of ordering and describing the world, of comparing different races of people, of reading the body. I mean, this is literally reading the body down here in the corner, because these are samples of skin. These are tattoos collected from the bodies of criminals, and they are used in order to define what is normal against what is pathological or what is criminal. One of the readings in particular is about disability, and which used to be called monstrosity. And there's a exhibit here of a what was then known as a monstrous body. Okay, and I know I'm racing through this, but there's so much here. Another issue, the fifth one, is just thinking about how all this plays out in popular culture. There is, because this is so visual, and even the writing is very visual about the body. We describe the body. There is all kinds of things to be said here about how through history the normal and the pathological, or the healthy and the unhealthy, or the upstanding citizen versus the criminal citizen, all these types of bodies have been defined and exhibited. So here are various these are not all, in fact, 19th century exhibits of, these are wax anatomical models of on this side, people with syphilis, and this acts as a kind of warning to viewers about the dangers of syphilis. And this one's a dermatological moulage or wax copy of various skin disorder. And we have here advertisements for, or images of, these kinds of freak shows in which medicine crossed over, obviously, with entertainment. Okay, so this, just going back here for a second, this history leads into, in some way, feeds into another sort of strand of body studies. We have body studies, medical humanities, and then we have disability studies. And one of the key figures is Rosemary Garland Thompson, and in her book Freaks, talks about how, you know, the disabled body or the extraordinary body is absolutely fundamental to the narratives, important word, by which we make sense of ourselves and our world. They function as magnets to which culture secures its anxieties, questions, and needs at any given moment. Now, this idea is really there in the Shildrick reading in particular this week. But also the other readings this week. The idea that, you know, if we think back to Said in Occidental Orientalism, you define one by the other. I guess for body studies, the normal against the abnormal or the pathological is that same kind of binary. And the extraordinary or disabled body has been used to define the borders of the normal throughout history, although I should say in different ways. You know, so in the past, as Garland Thompson points out, the extraordinary or disabled body could have been seen as, you know, a wonder of nature or message from God, and as we know, that has changed quite a bit over time. So when we think about literature and art, we should think about how these kinds of bodies are represented in fairy tale and fable, in realism and also sentimentalism, in science fiction in particular, and definitely in the Gothic. And in the Gothic, those kinds of monsters and freaks remind us of how fragile our ordered world is. They're always there as a kind of foil or a mirror against which we measure all kinds of things in this safe, ordered, civilized world. In Gothic literature, that is. Okay, so one of the big issues is, which I briefly mentioned, the body as text. There's a long history in reading the body, deciphering the body, trying to figure out the very, very, very important, the immaterial, or the things that can't be seen by the material body. Now, there is a science, or some people call it a pseudoscience, there's a couple of them, in the 18th and 19th centuries, which were about reading the body in order to understand the individual. So we have, for example, here on this side, this is physiognomy, that's reading the face, this is physiognomy, although this is the full body in this case. And then there's phrenology, which is reading the skull. And I bring these up. I don't want to say too much about them. I'd love to say lots about them, but we just don't have time. But I just want to say that the aims of these, you know, to us they seem like crazy sciences, like very unscientific sciences. But it's the point that their aims speak to a long swathe of history, and one in which we are still living very, very much. And they're perennial kind of aims. They are there throughout our history. And what is this aim or aims? It's this. So the hope of physiognomy was to do this: discover the relation between the exterior and the interior, the visible surface and the invisible spirit, between the perceptible, noses, foreheads, etc., and the imperceptible, the mind, the desires, the soul, the spirit, the compulsions, the intelligence, intellect, all that stuff that you can't see, point to, touch, the imperceptible stuff. So it's trying to join these things up. Okay. Now, since then, there has been all kinds of developments through science and through the arts that engage with those aims. So here we have, here's two scientific ones. So we have X-rays of criminal brains, and trying to read those brains and link the way they look, they're anomalous, they're long, they're whatever, they have lesions on them, and link that to certain crimes, like in this case vagrancy or rape, violence, etc. And here, this is from Francis Galton, the cousin of Charles Darwin, who's using photography in order to make these images. He's putting like the transparency one on top of the other in order to identify what a diseased face looks like or a criminal face looks like against a healthy face. Are there common features that we can read that will identify these various kinds or types of people? Now, contemporary art is dealing very much with these aims. So here we have Catherine Dawson's wonderful My Soul, which you'll notice is the brain, and is a copy of her brain now in 3D, which is obviously engaging with Cartesian dualism, with medicine's desire to read the body. And here the photographer Bernhard Hasse, German photographer, who's engaging directly with this composite photography, but instead of making it easier to read, he's cut and stapled together parts of various portraits of an individual, making it more difficult to read. So making a point about our attempts to read the body. Okay, so this I've kind of mentioned there. This feeds strongly into this urge to normalize and order our world via the body. I'm going to mention biopolitics again soon. So the science and culture of normality is very, very strongly there. And I wish I had tons of time to spend on this, but I don't. But this relates to our reading about contagion, and we're going to look at this in a second. What was I going to say about that? And the body borders, and the normal, healthy and proper body, defining that against whatever threatens it. So these are images that come from the history of eugenics, which some of you may have heard about, but which is a science or pseudoscience which emerged in the early 20th century, which really set out to define what is superior and healthy and good and attractive and desirable and normal, supposedly, in regards to human body and intelligence and psychology, and against what is not, and to try to introduce policies and practices that would try to get rid of undesirable traits. And this tipped into very, very dark stuff, in which obviously the disabled body, or the body that was defined as racially other to the blonde, white, European American, or the sexually anomalous body, all these kinds of things, of all these ways of othering the body that didn't look or didn't fit into this model of health and proper and contained and ordered and productive body, was excluded. So I think I messed up my sentence there. Okay, but you get what I mean. So this is all there. This one's there's just so much that can be said about those, so you might want to discuss it in seminar. Okay, moving on, or I'll run out of time. Another issue, a ninth issue. Do you see how much there is here? Is just to think a little bit more about how genes fit together with gender and sex, and you can hook this together with other weeks where we've looked at Foucault and the history of sexuality, and weeks that are coming on sexuality, with Jana Funke. And in here, I won't go into this too much, but it's interesting to look back, as happens in our readings this week, to look back in history to the way knowledge is built and to think about where that knowledge goes. So this is a medic in 1860, Thomas Laycock, talking about mind and brain and saying, hey, the nervous system of woman differs in some respects fundamentally from that of man. The brain of woman weighs from 4 to 8 ounces less than the brain of man, and the less average in Scotch women to be 4 ounces. Woman, as compared with man, is of nervous temperament. So all this, well, let's call it what it is, all of this garbage, it is really the basis of all kinds of gendering of bodies, that again, comparing and contrast, and women found wanting compared to men. And the reason I particularly, I brought that quote up particularly is because it, you know, not that long ago, somebody in an American university who calls himself a neuroscientist revisited again this idea of brain weight being linked to intelligence. Really ridiculous stuff. But it does show you how medicine, again, this is worth reiterating, medicine and culture are not separable. They feed into each other, and so stuff that seems like hard science is really, really informed by our attitudes and biases in culture, and vice versa. Science is often used to shore up those unfounded biases. Okay, so all this stuff is there in psychological novels, realism, confessional poetry, and body art more recently, and feminist art. Like the Guerrilla Girls, for instance. And again, if you don't know who they are, the really interesting feminist artist collective who did some really interesting things in the 80s to challenge lots of this stuff, and I would say Google them. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there, and we're going to come back to think about how all this stuff leads into critical questions for us. Oh my goodness, I've gone way over time. It's 32 minutes. Woo, I better stop. Okay,